There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's program from the Newark Public Library, the Newark History Society, a look ahead. I'm Tom Ankner, the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage you all to fill out your census forms. Filling out the census is one small but very important thing everyone can do right now to help our city and our communities. If you haven't done so yet, please go to my2020census.gov and fill out the brief questionnaire. The information you provide affects funding for healthcare, transportation, your local schools, and many other needs. Remember, my2020census.gov. It is safe, secure, and confidential, and you can fill it out until the end of this month. Today, we are being given a preview of programs from the Newark History Society during the upcoming year. Founded in 2002, the NHS works to, quote, expand knowledge of Newark's past so that we may better understand the present, end quote. The group does this through programs that are free and open to the public. We will get a preview of some of those programs today. Our guests are Timothy J. Crist, the president and co-founder of the Newark History Society, Noelle Lorraine Williams, an artist and historian who will be a presenter at 2 NHS events in the coming year, and George Robb, a professor of history at William Patterson University and NHS board member who will also be a presenter at 3 of the organization's events this year. Tim, Noelle, and George, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Okay. We ask that everyone in the Zoom room leave their cameras and microphones off. If you have any questions for our panelists, type them in the chat box, please. So Tim, I'd like to start with you. The Newark History Society is turning 18 this year, an age at which many parents send their children off to college. The fathers of this organization, can you talk a little bit about its history and why was it founded and what type of gap were you and the other founders seeking to fill? And how do you think it's done toward filling that gap?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tom. It's good to join the Newark Public Library in this way. We partnered with the library from the very beginning, and indeed one of our founders was your predecessor, Charles Cummings, the long time and much beloved keeper of the New Jersey Reference Room, now called the Charles Cummings New Jersey Information Center. And along with Warren Grover, who was just finishing up his work, his book on Nazis in Newark, and myself, we were aware of a gap in the Newark ecosphere about history. A number of people were doing some research, but there really wasn't a forum for sharing that. There wasn't a consistent way of engaging members of the public in the stories about Newark, and we thought that putting together a series of public programs was one of the ways that we could encourage the study and knowledge and research of Newark's history. Newark as a city is really one of the most fascinating ones in the country. It's one of the oldest. It's gone through nearly all the phases that the American story has gone through, and we have been very pleased over the last 18 years to see the response to the 85 or 90 public programs that we put on, to see the amount of research that is being done about Newark by several of the people who are part of this program or listening. And we're excited about this coming year when we have 6 programs lined up, both in cooperation with the Newark Public Library and 3 with NJPAC.
Okay, thank you. So now let's talk about some of this year's programs. Noelle and George, you will be the 2 presenters at an event later this month. On Tuesday, September 22nd, the NHS and Newark Public Library will be co-sponsoring the Battle Over Women's Suffrage in Newark. The event, a webinar, is tied to an exhibit now on the 3rd floor of the main library on Washington Street. Noelle, you were the curator of the exhibit, and George, you served as an advisor. Noelle, can you talk a little bit about the exhibit and how the program on the 22nd complements it?
Great. Thanks again for inviting us to speak about this today. So one of the great things about radical women fighting for power and the vote in New Jersey is that from the onset, it had a charge to integrate voices that we traditionally do not hear about in the discussion about the 19th Amendment and suffrage in New Jersey. So we had a mandate to include the voices of African-American women, and we also included immigrant women into the discussion. And also we worked to kind of encompass the various histories of women. So for example, in the beginning, we situated, whereas Native American women's history and African American women's history and the work for abolition are all the predecessors to the work that culminates in the 19th Amendment being ratified in New Jersey in 1920. And so as an activist scholar for me, it was an amazing opportunity. And many thanks to the Historical Commission, they funded the 2 years of research. And that's absolutely necessary if we're going to work to transform these narratives. This morning, I spoke with the Historical Commission, and I said, it's important for us to understand that transforming these narratives is not about being kind or nice, or that we're doing these things to be like better people or kind of have a moral agenda, even though that can be a part of it. But it's more about historical truths, you know? African-American women like Blanche Harris, and as we discussed, Florence Randolph, more folks know about her, she's a reverend at the AME Church, were folks who contributed to the discussion and the activism around getting people involved in this issue. And also just letting the audience know that these women were also a part of other movements. So they were also a part of anti-lynching, they were part of NAACP, they were part of their various churches. And so it gives people a more truthful account. And that's an important part to having conversations in our society.
Okay, all right, thank you. So George, how do you see the September 22nd event adding to the exhibit?
Well, so I'm mostly going to be talking about people in Newark who are against giving women the vote. So that's another perspective that doesn't get looked at very much. Obviously, I'm not going to be celebrating these people, but I mean, that's part of the reason it took so long for women to get the vote, is because there was such a determined opposition to it from so many different kinds of constituencies. But I mean, maybe to build on some of the things that Noelle was saying, I think that's the real strength, or can be a real strength of local history. So if you're telling the story of women's suffrage from the national level, then it's going to be one that's very limited. And it's going to again and again focus on this handful of already well-known people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Oh, and maybe we'll throw in Sojourner Truth just to have a little bit of diversity. But once you start getting down at the grassroots level, and once you start looking at communities, at the state level, but certainly especially at community level, like at a city like Newark, or looking at suburban communities and seeing who are the people there? Who are the people on the ground who are organizing? And, like all politics is local, all history is local too. And you get a much more diverse story. When you start looking at Newark and who are the suffrage activists in Newark, and then suddenly it's like you find a lot of Black women, and you find a lot of immigrant women, and you find a lot of union activists and working class women and things like that fall out of the story if you're looking at the kind of the well-known presidents of these organizations at a national level. So I think that's a real strength of the exhibit that Noelle curated. And those are things that we'll try to point out, I think, in our event in September, later in the month.
Yes, a couple of weeks.
Yes, indeed.
22nd, yes. So it's good that something like that, a group like the Newark History Society is having this event. Because it focuses on a local aspect.
Yeah, right. It tells a story from a local perspective.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. So The next event will be on November 9th. Monumental Newark, Gutzon Borglum's Seated Lincoln and the Wars of America, will examine 2 local monuments that have been the focus of attention in recent years. Talk a bit about the November program.
I'll jump in on that. It's one that's quite timely, and we're really glad that it's on the docket for this fall, particularly given all the discussion around monuments over the since George Floyd's murder at the end of May, but even before, since there was a really interesting reinterpretation of the Words of America monument in Military Park that Rutgers Newark helped to bring together last year. Monuments tend to be rooted in place, but their understanding, the interpretation of them, the perspective about them is not rooted in place. And what we wanted to do was to step back and look at 2 of the most famous monuments in Newark, the Gutzon Borglum's Seated Lincoln near the Essex County Courthouse, which must be the most beloved spot in all of Newark. It's a rite of passage for children to have their photo taken next to Lincoln. There
George is showing a
I've got a bookend, you know.
Bookend, and
one of my
and also the Wars of America. So Guy Sterling is going to discuss the Seated Lincoln. Guy is a retired Star Ledger reporter and a local historian who has done so much in so many areas related to Newark. And Gordon Bond, of another Newark resident, the man behind the Garden State Legacy website and online magazine, is going to talk about the Wars of America. They will focus not just on Borglum, but also Amos Van Horn, who financed the place of these monuments, and discuss what they meant, why they were constructed in the first place, how they've been viewed over the years, how that has changed. Now, we've asked Natalie Borisovitz, who's the reference librarian at Rutgers Newark's Dana Library, to introduce the program and provide some context about Borglum, the man, who, and that framing has changed over the past year as more attention has been paid to his own
racism.
Well, it's his membership or support for the KKK.
Racism.
So it's a complex story, and I just recall what Clement Price said so many times, that when you begin to understand that it's complex, you're beginning to get a little bit more understanding. So that's our hope out of the program. We hope that it leads to good discussion after the presentations, and greater awareness of why the monuments were put there in the first place, and what they can mean to different groups over time.
And I would just like to note that Mark wrote a really interesting essay with regard to this topic for the project last year.
Yeah, Mark Krasovic's background, worked research in the Borglum papers at the Library of Congress. George, I know you've looked at those papers too. Very rich in background material related to a number of Newark projects.
Okay. Great. So that program will be followed in January by the Morris Canal and the Business of Newark. John Prieto is the presenter. Can you tell us something about that program, Tim?
Yeah, at last. I mean, the Morris Canal is one of the most important infrastructure projects in Newark, and we've been looking for years for somebody to lead a program on that topic, and this one has come together. The Morris Canal in the 1820s, 1830s was part of the transformation of Newark into an industrial powerhouse. It, was bringing coal from Pennsylvania and things like that, and it was soon overtaken by the spread of the railroads. But the Morris Canal and the fact that it came through Newark is a key factor in Newark's development as an industrial center. And he's going to focus, I believe, on the businesses that situated along the canal. And you just take in mind one, I don't know if he's going to talk about it, but the Bannister Shoe Company. The library has a nice little archive of Bannister Shoe Company materials, and we've been in correspondence with one of the Bannister descendants. But it was its factory. It was one of the premier shoe companies in the country. Never retail, always wholesale to the top end of the trade. Its factory was on the canal near Plain Street. And then later, when they built a much larger factory, which is still there, although now a U-Haul storage center up on near First Street and Orange Street, that was once again on the canal. The canal was an important way of anchoring the industrial backbone of Newark. So that one, since it's a virtual discussion in January, we're taking, if it were live, we wouldn't take the risk of scheduling it in the middle of winter. But that's why we're able to offer 6 programs this year. But really excited about being able to address the Morris Canal at last.
And not everyone knows that the Morris Canal ran along what is now, through Newark, ran along what is now the light rail.
Right, and if you look, the downtown stations, they have those great WPA murals that show scenes of the Morris Canal. So yeah, people are like, why are all these scenes of the canal? That's the reason why. Yeah,
the canal bed.
Yeah, right.
So Noelle and George will be back in March for Forgotten Newark Riots, 1834, 1854, and 1917. They will be presenting with Father Augustine Curley of St. Benedict's Prep. George, what can you tell us about that program?
Well, I can tell you I'm talking about what was called a race riot in Newark in 1917. So, 50 years before, almost to the, day, not to the day, but 50 years before the more famous, incident in 1967. It took place during World War I in Newark. And when the African-American population had grown very dramatically in the period between like 1910, 1920, almost doubled. And a lot of, the Great Migration, there's a lot of job opportunities in defense industry in Newark during World War I. And there's a huge housing crunch. So African-Americans moving up to Newark in the early 20th century really didn't have trouble finding jobs, but they did find trouble finding housing because a lot of housing discrimination. A lot of neighborhoods would not rent out housing. African Americans were simply not welcomed. So there was a real concentration of African Americans in certain central wards, and a lot of the newcomers from the South, especially in the 3rd Ward, which before that had been a solidly Jewish neighborhood, and it's changing over time. So there are tensions in that neighborhood already between older residents and the newer African-American residents. And there's an incident that takes place in 1917 that sparks a kind of a violence in the neighborhood. I won't say anything more than that, but it's not, luckily no one dies, no one's killed, which, racial violence at that time could be horrendous in the United States. But it was one that did, in some ways, energize the African-American community. And usually when we talk about a race riot in the United States in the early 20th century, we're talking about mobs of white people attacking Black neighborhoods and burning them down. I mean, those are the really famous race riots in the early 20th century. So it's nothing on this scale. And the African-Americans in Newark fought back. They defended their turf. And a couple months after this, there's a big parade in Newark, a silent parade in which African-Americans parade down Broad Street protesting segregation, protesting discrimination, not just in Newark, but for example, in East St. Louis, where there was a very deadly race riot shortly before that time. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on.
So Noelle, what will you be talking about? One of the 19th century riots, of course, but you've done a lot of research into 19th century Newark as well, right?
Yeah, I was asked to speak on the 1834 riot at the 4th Presbyterian Church. The 4th Presbyterian Church used to be where we would say, I guess, the corner of Washington and Academy Street. And the reverend for that church was Reverend Weeks. Reverend Weeks was an anti-slavery reverend. It's important for us always to be clear that there's a difference between abolitionists during this period who were perceived to be, radicals and crazy people for wanting to abolish slavery immediately, and anti-slavery people who believed in a gradualist approach that often encompassed colonization. So that's removing free African Americans to what would become Liberia. But there were also other considerations like South America, other states in the United States. One thing you learn about American history is that the relocation of certain undesirable populations comes up a lot in the 19th century. And we see it at its worst with the Trail of Tears. But also new scholarship has also highlighted how Irish people were deported back to Ireland as well. And so with Reverend Weeks, he was a part of the Anti-Slavery Society here in Newark. And when I was looking through their meeting notes, I noticed that in the notes, it said that the reverends would go to their various churches and they would bring a guest and they would preach on anti-slavery work. Later on, I learned about the incident with Reverend Weeks. And basically with this incident, he did, as they all promised to do, the various reverends in the anti-slavery group, and he brought a Black person to the church. And according to various accounts, the Black man who was a barber and a well-respected African-American here in Newark. I'm not sure who he is. I'm figuring that out through the directories, but the articles that are based out of New York and in Newark do not use his name. And so one thing that's consistent through all the articles is that when Reverend Weeks began his protest, people in the church who might have been there in anticipation of the speech, they started to disrupt it. And then other people came and it turned into a mob of hundreds of people on Washington and Academy, if you can imagine it, who tore down the curtains and knocked over the benches. And basically Reverend Weeks had to escape. He and his wife. The Black man also had to escape. In one newspaper account, he was actually imprisoned in the jail so that the mob would not kill him. They went to his barber shop to try to hurt him. And it was just a horrible incident that was recorded both in the New York and Newark newspapers. And interestingly, other incidents, other race riots were happening in New York during the same period. So in a way, probably for the panel, I'll contextualize it also within the context of the other race riots that were happening that year.
Okay. And I guess Father Curley will be talking about the 1854, that was the St. Mary's riot, right?
Yeah, that's right, Tom. And just following up on Noelle, I hope this, we could do a future program. It would be hard listening, but on the American Colonization Society efforts in Newark, a number of the leaders were in Newark. New Jersey was at the forefront of that, and it's all part, again, of the American story. The treatment of Blacks in Newark at that time. It's an interesting story. 1854 was the riot at St. Mary's Church. Father Curley of St. Benedict's will discuss that. That was a know-nothing riot. Know-nothing because when the folks were asked why they did something, they said, "I know nothing." But it was generally an Irish Protestant, Irish Catholic conflict that spilled over into this German church of St. Mary's, which was serving the German community at the time. It was the old church. The new St. Mary's, the one that's still there now, was built in 1857. And I'm looking forward to this. I recently did some work on my wife's family in Newark, found that my children are 5th generation born in Newark, and the first member of her family was they were members of St. Mary's and married 2 weeks before that riot. So I suspect they knew all about this in 1854, but it was part of the anti-German, particularly the anti-Catholic German sentiment in Newark. The old line Protestants were not enamored of Germans drinking beer and having a good time on Sunday due to their Sabbath observance tradition. So each of these three, and we could have picked other civil disturbances, riots, protests, going certainly back into the 18th, even the 17th century. But each of them is about a community resisting newcomers, resisting opening opportunity to newer groups or to those who were different. And again, this is all part of the American story, and the Newark thread through all this is a way of getting at those larger themes.
Okay. So in April, Gail Malmgreen will be providing another update on the Newark Archives project, this time documenting some of the things she uncovered in Washington, D.C. related to Newark. I know she's been there several times, I believe, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Tim?
George, I'll get started on this, but I'm doing too much talking. You run with this. The Newark Archives project is probably our biggest contribution to the study of Newark history. Anybody looking into a topic about Newark should start with the Newark Archives project. There are over 4,000 entries now describing different archival collections in a host of institutions around the United States, not just Newark or New Jersey. It's almost become the online database, which you find by typing in Newark Archives Project, is almost become an encyclopedia of Newark, with gaps, of course, where there aren't archival collections. But the background material that Gail and her colleagues have put together on each of the collections provides a wealth of information about different aspects of Newark's history. But she has, this will be the third time that she's reported to the Newark History Society on her work. This time she wanted to focus on the collections in Washington, D.C. We mentioned the Borglum collection at the Library of Congress earlier, but there are immensely valuable collections, including, and Noelle, I'm gonna mess this up, but is it the National Conference of Negro Women or something like that? Those records are in the National Archives, actually over in Maryland, but just enormous resources have come to light related to Newark, and it should spark a great deal of new research. And though any of us who have done any work, any research, whether it's for a college paper or for one of George's books, knows how interesting it is to hear about new sources, new materials, new insights that can be gleaned by discovering those new resources. George, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think so. This is, like, as you say, this is the third update. Every couple of years, Gail will talk about new things, sources about Newark she's found. And the thing is, these are things that are in libraries all over the country, hiding in plain sight. So it's not necessarily a question of just doing, you think, oh, you can just find everything on the internet. Well, unfortunately, you can't, right? So you could say, oh, there's a library, here's a Yale University. It's a great library. It has a lot of archives. Let's do a search for Newark and see what shows up. Maybe a few things will show up, maybe nothing will show up. But what Gail does, being a librarian and an archivist and knowing how to do these searches, she visits, sometimes in person, often in person, these libraries, and she goes through their finding aids, and she finds sources about Newark that aren't listed as Newark related. So maybe the personal papers of a person who lived in Newark, and the cataloger for that collection at whatever library it's at will say, oh, these are the papers of so-and-so, and they're about, this, they're about the civil rights movement, they're about, industry, they're about banking, but there's no mention of Newark. And so it's Gail who teases that out and makes those connections. And so for those of us who are interested in Newark history and want to find out materials on Newark history that are scattered all over the United States, the Newark Archives Project has been really invaluable because she has found materials, important materials that are at libraries, but that don't list that those materials are related to Newark. And so she's able to make those connections and make that material, relevant to us in a way that it wouldn't have been before.
Yeah.
And I know that at least one of her trips to Washington, she stayed several days.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
She's been there several times. And again, it's something that, Tom, we've really appreciated the help of the Newark Public Library and others in drawing attention to new collections that come in, as you're constantly getting new collections. But we're not aware of any other city in the United States that has attempted something similar to actually go out and identify collections related to, in this case, to Newark or to Newarkers. And there are somewhat similar efforts in Philadelphia or Chicago, but this is really a remarkable resource that has come together over now, 8 or 10 years, and is a prime focus for our society. And then it has its impact. I know a year ago when the New Jersey Historical Commission had its History Day conference, Gail was there, I was there, George, I think you were, that there ended up being more papers that are related to Newark than to any other section of the state of New Jersey. And I think that speaks to this renaissance, this spread of interest in Newark and the different stories that need to come to light. Good stories, tough stories, but revealing stories.
Yeah, it's true. I'm doing an exhibition at the library next year called Black Power 19th Century. And in the beginning, the way that I got my footing in the project was through the New Jersey room at Newark Public Library and through the Presbyterian Society in Philadelphia. So it's like, I had never even been so familiar with Philadelphia, and I had to make about 10 trips to learn about First Presbyterian Church because most of their papers were down there. And then I learned more about African Americans in Brooklyn as well, in Philadelphia at the Presbyterian Society. So it's true. It's a lot of the history you have to go to other sites to piece together this Newark history.
Okay. So George, I'd like you to talk about the final event of the upcoming year. It will be in May, the Noble Experiment in Newark, Temperance, Prohibition, and Bootlegging.
Yeah, so
by you, Tom McCabe, and Laura Troiano. Can you talk about that program?
Yeah, so as people may know, Newark was a huge center of the liquor industry in the United States and in New Jersey. Probably after St. Louis and Milwaukee, Newark had more breweries than any other city in the United States. In the early 20th century, Newark had something like, 1,200 saloons, right? I mean, you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a saloon in Newark. So it employed a lot of people. It was an important part of especially male culture, certain immigrant community cultures as well. And so that's one thing we're going to kind of look at, look at the importance of the liquor industry in Newark, but also it was controversial because, it came to be an important part of the women's movement in the United States, pointing out things like, well, drunkenness is a huge problem in an American society. And it certainly was even more so then, right? And men who got their paychecks and went to the saloon and drank half of it away and came home drunk and beat their wives. And so, I mean, there these are not imaginary things. I mean, there are reasons why women were mainstays of a temperance movement in the United States. It wasn't because they were just like, puritanical killjoys. And so we're going to be looking at some of these things. So the connections between alcohol and violence and temperance, and that are backgrounds to prohibition coming into the United States in the 1920s. So it's not going to be just about prohibition. It's going to be looking at some of the background to prohibition. Of course, prohibition lasts for over 10 years. And so we're just sort of beginning, we talk about centennials, the centennial of prohibition is going to be going on for a long time. And so there's room for lots of programs over the next 10 years, looking at different aspects of prohibition, like bootlegging and organized crime and things like that. So this is our sort of, maybe our first temperance alcohol prohibition program. And we'll look at some of those big issues as a way to sort of set up these themes, and then we'll follow through maybe in some later years by looking at some of these other issues. So
Okay.
I'm going to be looking at the beginnings of the temperance movement, and I think Michelle is going to be talking about alcohol as a source of crime and the ways in which lawyers used alcohol as a defense for crime, and Laura is going to be looking at some of the ways in which prohibition did lead to a rise in crime.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. So I don't see any questions in the chat box. If somebody has questions, please type them in the chat box. And Beth, my colleague Beth, is also looking at the Facebook page. If there's any questions there, she'll let us know. But I don't really see any questions yet. Is there anything else that any of you would like to say?
Well, I just wanted to quickly say it's just so amazing the overlap in these stories. George is speaking about the temperance movement. And one of the things that came out in our research is that just the motivations of some of the women in these movements. I came after second wave feminism. I'm in between like a second wave and third wave feminist in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I was raised with a disrespect of all things temperance and also, like anti-prostitution laws. I was raised to be like a radical feminist. So revisiting suffrage now, and like George said, like really going into these stories of these women, which we will touch on for the panel, you come to learn that the temperance, like he said, it's not just this moral high-handed issue. It's literally like women needing to feed their children and their husbands, not giving them the money to feed it, There's various economic issues that come up for privileged women as well as working class women that we see that deal with economics, how privileged women, if they're left by their husbands, they lose their estates. If their husband dies, they're allowed to live in the house. What is it, 6 months or a year? Then potentially your son or your husband's brother can actually put you out, And so there are these economic themes that run under these stories and these various overlaps that we could be just telling these various stories for years and years. But it is significant how Newark potentially as like if we think of it as like a settler community, a colonial community, an industrial community, these various discussions that go on with abolition, suffrage, many of the main suffrage organizations are here in Newark. Alice Paul comes from New Jersey. Florence Randolph is in Jersey City. And we see that Newark represents these various transitions that the country goes into as it works to articulate what citizenship is and who can be a part of it and who can't. So I think there's just such opportunity with the Newark History Society workshops to explore these themes and connect with them.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
And I think if I may, Tom, it's just, local history sometimes gets a bad repute, bad reputation and such. And, you know, sometimes micro history can just get so detailed that it's hard to draw anything from it. But as you've heard from this discussion, these really inform larger themes, and they inform what it means to be a citizen in the country today. And what we like is that it's also an opportunity for PhD historians, amateur historians, students, members of the public who are just interested in the topic to come together in the public square, as it were, and exchange information, exchange ideas, and stimulate each other rather than kind of separate into separate groups. So in that way, we think that these programs, again, thanks to the Newark Public Library and NJPAC, help to build civil society, the civic life in our city. So we're excited to continue to do this. We've been doing it for 18 years, and you know, I look at Noelle and George and others who've signed up for this. That with luck, we'll be doing it for another 18 years, and we won't have come anywhere close to running out of good topics to cover.
So Bill May just wrote in the chat room, wherever America's going, Newark will get there first. A statement attributed to Ken Gibson, Mayor Ken.
Amen.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And that was the title of one of our programs about Ken Gibson when he joined us, and others from his administration, Tom Banker and others, to really take an early look at his administration. And heaven knows, I'm glad to see that others are drawing attention to the 50th anniversary of Ken Gibson's election as mayor of Newark.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Tim, Noelle, and George, for sitting down with me today. And thank you to everyone else who took part in this program. We will, and remember to join us for the program on the 22nd. That is
6 o'clock.
22nd, it's Tuesday at 6 p.m., I believe. Is that right?
We'll send out reminders.
Yeah, no, I know there's going to be an email reminder. So, and then also join me next Monday for another of our NPL at Home sessions designed to highlight interesting and exciting items from the special collections of the Newark Public Library. On Monday, I will be sitting down with Bill May, who's here in the Zoom room today, musician, photographer, and educator, to talk about a collection of photos he donated to the library a couple of years ago. Bill taught music to Newark children for 4 decades, and his photos document the changing school system between the 1970s and the early 2000s. That is Monday, September 14th at 1:00 p.m. Have a good day, everyone. Be safe.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Thank you.